Live and on tape from Silicon Valley, this is Beyond the Bot, hosted by Dave Dabbah, CMO at Robocorp. Now to the host that can't stop talking about Gen 2 RPA and all things robotic process automation, Dave Dabbah.
Welcome to Beyond the Bot. I am Dave Dabbah, the CMO of Robocorp, and thank you so much for joining us today on Beyond the Bot, or as I like to call it, the BTB. Now, we've got a great show for you today, and as always, our focus on the BTB is on actual use cases of RPA and trends in the larger automation industry. Or as our good friends at Gartner like to call it, the hyper automation market. Now, our format for this show is really pretty simple. I've got 7 questions related to RPA. This is a one-on-one fireside chat format with, of course, without the actual fire. Our shows tend to last between 20 and 40 minutes. Now, joining me today on the BTB, we have a fantastic RPA thought leader who brings over 20 years of IT industry experience to the table with deep expertise in intelligent business process automation using RPA. Partha, the co-founder and CEO of Senzcraft. Partha, welcome to Beyond the Bot.
Thank you, Dave, for inviting me. Good to be here.
It is great to be here. Now, I purposely did not pronounce Partha's last name. Partha, why don't you tell the world how to pronounce your last name?
It's tough, but it's Partha Mukhopadhyay.
All right, fantastic. So as I mentioned, we've got 7 questions that we'll cover on today's show. Partha, let's dive into it with the first question being, what are you currently working on at this point in your career? And maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself as well.
Sure. The whole automation got kicked off in a big way around 7 years back, 2014, 2015. That's when, automation as we know it kind of started. And at that point, I was in a mid-sized company, and we were doing a little bit of corporate strategy think tank. And we realized that this is a big, kind of a big industry shift that's happening, and it's going to go on for maybe several decades. And we wanted to be a part of it, and we launched the automation practice, right? And that was sort of my initiation into it. And since then, so for the last 7 years, I have worked as a practice lead. I have worked as a consultant working with host of companies, Fortune 500 companies across industries. I have led automation COE myself for a very large, $100 billion plus organization. So I have real experience from the client side also. Right? I have really seen what are the struggles and pain points that clients have. So, I have a firsthand experience of that. I have worked very, very closely with functional teams, finance, supply chain, HR, you name it. I have worked very closely with them, helping them get the best results out of automation. So that was kind of my, journey and, initiation, so to say, in the automation world, Dave.
Nice. And hey, maybe expand a little bit more. So I think you worked for Cargill, if I remember correctly, and it's so funny. Like when we talk about people's sort of RPA journeys, into RPA, I certainly wasn't sitting there. Nobody wrote in my high school yearbook, "Enjoy your journey into RPA." It's such a sort of a new part of the of the business, where we've been heading over the last 5 to 7 years, and it's very interesting to see, especially how like bigger enterprises have embraced RPA. So anything you can sort of, expand on and tell us about how they were actually using RPA, because like one of the big things I get is there's this mystification almost of how is RPA actually used and how are corporations using it. And a lot of people don't want to actually tell you. So that is a big part of Beyond the Bot. We want to sort of not necessarily expose, but educate people on how RPA is being used effectively.
Yeah. So, first of all, by now I would think all the myths and the mysticism around RPA has been busted.
Yeah.
I would really hope so. But again, having said that, fundamentally, what is RPA? You have to think RPA like a software tool that is very, very capable to mimic human action. That's how RPA started, right? So anything as a person that I can do, for example, I can fire up a Windows Explorer, I can log into an application, I can use the application. All of that RPA robot, it's called a bot or a robot, can do. So effectively, the journey of RPA started by mimicking actions that people do or people do when they're working on a process. Right? That's how it all started, and that's how it is. It's getting sophisticated by the day. It does not rely as much on mimicking actions, but on APIs and other ways to work with applications. But that's happening, right? That's the evolution that's happened in the last 5 years or so. Coming to the other part of your question, right? At the enterprise, how it is getting used, right? So if you look at any large organization with large focus on operations, almost everywhere RPA started with the finance function, right? Because that's where three things came together. One, it's a very, very high transaction work. So for example, if you take vendor invoice processing, right? It's a high transaction work that needs to happen day in and day out. It's a tough ask because the process has to be compliance. It has to be highly accurately done. The second piece is that every year there is growth in terms of the volume of transactions processed, right? And third, there is always cost pressure. The pressure is not only to keep the cost flat, but year on year actually takes the cost down. Now, if you take RPA out of the equation, it's very, very difficult to achieve that, right? How do you automate? Using, any finance function will tell you they have automated using Excel and VB script and macros and stuff like that, right? That used to be the automation, in the earlier days. But that can't keep the cost down at scale, combining, capabilities like computer vision, ability to read documents and all. It doesn't have it, right? So you needed a tool which kind of brought these capabilities together to help deliver a transaction at scale and at ever lowering cost.
Yeah.
I think that's the beautiful combination that came together, and that, RPA kind of was able to deliver. And that's really kicked off the whole RPA adoption cycle.
Yeah. And I think like the, transaction at scale piece is really where this is all at. I mean, we're at this point now where, a lot of, especially on the enterprise side, they understand the financial model, if you will, of Gen 1 RPA versus a Gen 2 RPA, which we're going to cover a little bit more in detail. Just it's a teaser for the audience. We'll get into a little bit more of Gen 1 versus Gen 2 in just a little bit. But the cost component is definitely been a major factor, which has sort of led to the creation of what Gen 2 RPA is today. Hey, before I tell me a little bit about Senzcraft and what you're currently doing. I know you're the number one guy in charge. You're the co-founder, CEO of Senzcraft. You're bringing, as we mentioned in the opening, 20 years of experience. You've obviously worked with some significantly large corporations over the years on RPA projects. Would love to hear from you a little bit more about Senzcraft and what you guys are working on today.
Yeah. So first of all, I think let me do something which I have never shared at any forum. Why the name Senzcraft?
Yeah.
Right. I think it's very key to explaining the founding vision behind it. If you look at any business process for that matter, right, there are three things involved in it. First is sensing. If you take, for example, document, to read the content of the document, you are seeing. That's one of your sense in play, right? If you're dialing into an IVR and the machine is telling you something, you are listening to it, right? And then you are processing these inputs and coming to a decision, and you are crafting your responses. Hence the name Senzcraft, meaning you are sensing the inputs, from different sources, taking a decision based on it and crafting your response. And our vision is that today across organization, business processes are very complex, and Senzcraft will help you put this together, help do it in a very simple way.
There you go. I think it's the first breaking news that we've covered so far on Beyond the. That's really interesting, and I think it absolutely makes a lot of sense. I love that. Tell me a little bit more about the company and what you guys are working on as well.
Yeah. So fundamentally, there are two thought processes, right? One is with the large enterprise customers, the challenges that they face are quite different. For them, the challenge is actually about scaling, the automation initiatives. And I have had the good fortune of working with and talking to several of them. So scaling for the large enterprises represents a very different kind of a problem than say a SMB or a mid-market company. We are working with both because we believe that the problems are distinct enough to deserve specific attention on both, and we are trying to work actually on both sides. So on the enterprise side, right, the biggest challenge is none of the RPA initiatives, right? None of the RPA initiatives happen in vacuum. There is a context of business processes, right, which is inherited, which is as they are designed today. There's a context of the IT systems that are in play. And these systems and the currently existing business processes limit your options, right? So the first challenge there that the enterprises face is how do they change, modify, improve the processes? And second, what can they get out? What can they get out of their already made, possibly very large investments into their legacy IT systems, right? That's one side of it. The second problem faced by the enterprises is on how do they start a digitization journey involving every one of their employees, be it somebody on the customer service, be it somebody who's facing the customer, let's say in a bank, or a guy who is dealing with the supply chain and the vendor, right? How do you educate him on digitization and automation? How do you bring everybody up to speed? So that citizen enablement is the second biggest problem in all large organizations, and it's not easy. It's a big challenge. So these are some of the problems that we are trying to attack by bringing a completely new model of engagement. That's on the enterprise side. On the SMB side, actually the penetration of automation and next generation of business process automation actually has been low because fundamentally the barrier has been the amount of upfront investment that needs to be made, right? Yep. If you take the Gen 1 RPA tools, then cost is a barrier to adoption, at least at this point, right? We don't know how it will be 5 years from now, but at this point it still is. So how do you unlock? They are still, they are hungry for automation, right? They're hungry for process improvement. They're hungry to get to the next level of efficiency and productivity when they run their processes. But how do you get them? So there we are working on a completely different engagement model, which is more based on consumption, per unit transaction pricing, so on and so forth.
Got it.
So two different sides of the, side of client challenges that we are trying to address, Dave.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And this sort of leads us into the age-old discussion, the Gen 1 versus Gen 2 RPA discussion. And so the question is, really, from your perspective, what are the distinctions between Gen 1 and Gen 2 RPA? And I think more so for the mid-market to the enterprise than the SMB in this context.
Yeah, and so first let me cover just broadly Gen 2, Gen 1, and then I'll get to the specific for enterprise and mid-market. So first thing is, I think there are three clear distinctions. The first being the first criteria or the first parameter for Gen 2 is really not being locked into proprietary development tools, right? Because effectively what happens is that you lock down the business process, right? When you are stuck in proprietary standards, you're locking down your business process to those standards. Now, only time will tell, how good or bad that decision, right? We have seen acquisitions, and that throws a lot of uncertainty in the mix. So we will have to see that how that evolves. But fundamentally, if you are aligned with open source things that are built on standards and for example, languages which people don't have to learn like a completely new way, I think that I consider as one of the criteria. Second being the pricing model, right? Are the pricing models still infrastructure investment, license investment, regardless of what is your percentage of utilization, right? So what's your consumption model? That's the second part, right? And the third one really is that I believe that the discovery bit, right? The discovery and getting to know the process in detail backed by data, and the automation itself will start getting tightly coupled in the days to come.
Yeah.
So in my mind, a Gen 2 RPA, the third criteria is actually that is it a platform that is getting you closer to the discovery side as well? Because that's going to come in the days as enterprises get maturity. Now, the second part of the part of your question was, so what's the value proposition for the enterprise side and what's the value proposition for the mid market with those three criteria? I think for the enterprise, from experience, I can say that there's a lot of focus in every organization today on idea generation with citizens. But if you actually measure how much of those ideas get converted into and implemented, that number is pretty low. I think 60% of the ideas today don't get beyond the idea stage. And it's because that with, the moment you are talking scale, large number of ideas, many of them will not individually stand an ROI test. Yes, you will unlock productivity, but because you will save, even if you're saving, 8 hours, 10 hours for an employee, it's good savings because at the end of the day, at a large scale, the organization will gain huge productivity. But the moment you apply your financial matrices individually to that idea, that becomes a non-viable idea. And I myself, plead guilty to turning down many of them. So in my mind, Gen 2 RPAs with their attractive cost models allow you to unlock ideation at scale and do those ideas because your upfront investments are pretty low. And you pay almost by use, by hour, right? So that's on the, on the enterprise side. If I were to do the, pick one on the SMB side, I think SMB side, the barrier has been lowered because this is, cloud native. Again, a very important distinction, cloud native. And second, cost models allow you to get on board and start improving your business processes without upfront costs.
Yeah.
So lowering the barrier on the mid-market side. So those two, I would say, that are really distinctive advantages with the Gen 2 RPA.
Yeah, and I sort of echo what you just said. What I'm seeing in the market as well is, in the enterprise and the mid market specifically, obviously companies want to save money and are looking to improve processes and want to be able to scale up and scale down, bots as needed versus sort of the old school. I like to call it the black and white television days of Gen 1 RPA, sort of how the licensing model works. And so the advantages with, sort of consumption-based pricing and combining that with cloud orchestration has, really allowed, companies to consider, sort of utilizing a Gen 2 option. What's really interesting is 60% of all, sort of what you were talking about there with, 60% of all ideas that sort of come through the citizen developer channel never turn into anything. And that's something we're definitely hearing as well, where companies have some great ideas for automation and things they want to do with their automation, and just simply don't have the right systems and resources in place to make that happen. And I think that's the, in 5 years from now, that's one of the advantages of, I'm sure what we'll be calling Gen 3 RPA at that point, but it's the advantages, sort of the evolution of the market and the industry sector that we're in is going to continue to evolve, and those things that people really want to have done that they're unable to do today because of resources and costs are going to change, pretty dramatically, I think, over the next next couple years. Hey, so which takes me to I think we could do the whole show just on that topic, but we'll move on a little bit. I spend a lot of time personally with analysts, and I try not to get Partha. I really try not to get too stuck in the analyst world, but I do spend a lot of time. Some really good things, come out of both Forrester and Gartner. And Gartner recently published a stat that said by the year 2024, you got to love these by the year 2024 stats, but by the year 2024, 40% of RPA buyers will be looking at a multi-vendor strategy. And I think this is definitely, one of the things we're experiencing, at Robocorp. We'll go into a major, enterprise company whose logo is currently on, UiPath's website or Automation Anywhere's website or Blue Prism's website or Microsoft's website, and we'll be the second vendor in. And it's really interesting that, Gartner is actually like looking at this dual vendor strategy sort of concept. How do you think this is all going to play out? I guess you're sort of on the front lines of this as well. I'll pass it over to you and see what you want to say on this one.
In my past life, I have led the dual vendor strategy myself. So first, so you will get a pretty, straight feedback from the horse's mouth, so to say. So first thing is that why a dual vendor strategy? I think that's the most important question to ask, that why are enterprises pursuing a dual vendor strategy? I think fundamentally, it has been because of capability gaps in one product vendor versus the other, right? And when it comes to, I mean, not only the top three, but if you pick the top five, every one of them have their strong areas, right? Very strong product areas, right? Ultimately, it's a product and it's evolving, right? So today, one vendor might have a strong capability in an area A, next year, vendor A is going to catch up and vendor B will be ahead in, something else, right? So, but fundamentally, it boils down to the capability gaps. And in your organization, in your enterprise, do you have a use case with a large ROI, which needs that capability? That drives the decision, right?
Yeah.
And, we've come across cases like that where we needed a certain capability. We knew it is, much needed capability, and we could unlock, millions of dollars in value. with that capability. And one vendor did not have it, right? And perhaps it was a capability that this is not on the vendor's product roadmap. So what do you do then, right?
Right.
So then it makes sense for you to explore that, would bringing in a second vendor, second product with that capability make sense or not?
Yeah.
To a lot of enterprises, it makes sense. It seems like this is a good risk balancing strategy, that you are not putting all your business operations on one vendor. But I kind of are not big fan of that logic, because at least till now the standards are pretty much proprietary. It's very hard to switch out. So the business processes that you have automated in one, you can't switch them quickly, or you can't, there's no tool to switch it off from one vendor to the other, right? So you are stuck on the business process that you are on. Yes, you can, of course, you can break them, and with effort you can do anything, right? You can port them and all that. But then, so fundamentally, the why and the motivation behind picking two vendor strategy is important. And I think that boils down to capability. At least that's what I have seen. Now in future, if I look down several years, is that kind of a product capability gap, will it stay? It may, and it may not, because I think the capability gaps and the gaps that we are seeing today would be considered fairly basic, 5 years down the line, right? So at a base level, I think most products will offer very advanced capabilities, but perhaps every year the new innovative features that they are going to release, there will be differences between that. Would that warrant for a second investment? I am not sure. But right now there are two, just to summarize, so there are two reasons for that dual vendor strategy. One, as I said, capability gap. Second is, if you take things that you can't do today with an RPA product, and you are thinking that, okay, can I bring a low code platform or a Gen 2 RPA to do it, right? In my mind, that makes sense, right? So you have to look at automation as a holistic portfolio of offerings, or as a center of excellence. It's part of your portfolio, right? And it can't have only RPA as the only hammer for everything, right? You have to balance it out. So you can put these components together. So for example, a Gen 1 RPA, which you might have already invested in, that drives your a set of cases, and the Gen 2 RPA or low code drives things which which are on the low ROI but at a large scale, right? So you take a distinct approach depending on your enterprise problems and what you want to accomplish at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think one of the big issues is how do you migrate from one RPA vendor to another, and that I've been in those rooms before, where like the guy that bought IBM, doesn't want to not continue to use IBM for whatever they're using IBM for. And the other guy is like, let's go try OpenText. And so they split up, use cases, and they end up taking a new use case, something that doesn't need to get migrated. And they roll it back. I'm going back like 15 years of my career to a completely different, type of scenario. But that's a lot of what I think we're seeing here. There are some clients where they're looking to immediately migrate specific automations over. But I think a big part of the dual vendor strategy is new things. We talked a lot about how the citizen developers, 60% of what they're coming up with is being ignored entirely. And so when you look at sort of other solutions that might be in the marketplace to solve some of those problems pretty rapidly, you could see how, especially on the enterprise side, companies will be a little bit more open and comfortable with a dual vendor strategy at that point.
And Dave, I know that Robocorp is doing some great stuff with some of the migrations.
I mean, we're definitely doing a lot of things with migrations, but we see it though, every day, and we're talking to huge corporations, and all the way down to companies you've probably never heard of before, and in the scenarios where people have a Gen 1 provider sort of already in place, there's obviously a reason that they're looking at alternatives. And a lot of times the quickest way to sort of work with them is on something new, as opposed to setting up migrations. But we I should shout out. I should do shout outs on the show. A shout out to our customer success team, because we are working on a lot of enterprise migrations as well, and those are not simplistic by any stretch of the imagination. Hey, Partha, so we got 3 questions to go. Super simple. Specifically for Senzcraft, I love that we on this show today broke how you came up with the name and what was behind it. What kind of things are you guys specifically working on at Senzcraft that you think are would be interesting to share with the audience?
Sure. So at Senzcraft, we are focusing on a couple of functional areas. The first being finance and accounting. I know it's been the most well-known area for finance teams and enterprises, but there are two things that prompted our decision to work in the finance and accounting area. First, we believe that especially both in enterprise, right? I mean, having spoken to a couple of enterprises in the last few months since we launched this stuff, we realized that a lot of enterprises are still looking to get to the best ROI, on their finance, AP and AR, particularly AP and AR processes, right? Account payable and account processes. That's one. Second, right? I fundamentally believe that the focus of automation has been so much on automating the existing processes, right? And when you look at existing processes, you are bounded and you are constrained by the fact that these are processes designed to be run by people, right? But the whole automation gives you a tool set to design new processes which are not limited by people capabilities, right? So like today I was talking to one of the audit firms, right? And they wanted to see if we can automate the audit function, right? Historically, audit has been A, sample driven, B, done at specific times. But with automation, you can completely rethink the process and say, first, I don't need to do sampling anymore. I can go for 90, 100% check, right? Number one. Second, why do I have to do it at a certain point in time? It's done that way because we didn't know any better way to do it. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? So it can actually, it can be a constant process throughout the year as well, right? So fundamentally, we believe that newer processes that are meant to be automation first should come to play. And we believe that finance, accounting, audit will be one such area for disruption. So that's one of our process areas. The second is in the whole supply chain and logistics space, right? With COVID and the pandemic, this area has been hugely disrupted with lockdowns and, now with, all the things that is going on in the world. Supply chain is hugely disrupted, especially the demand is very, very uncertain, right? So which has effectively put all the players who have large supply chain teams, the logistics companies in quite a bit of disarray, so to say, right? So for them, looking at the processes in a new light, in a new way, is an imperative. It's no longer an option, right? Now, law IoT or Industry 4.0 has driven that in, warehousing, remote infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to traditional business processes, there's a huge scope of digitization and looking at these in an automated, machine-driven way. that's what we are focusing on. We are working with some clients on some very interesting use cases in this space as well, Dave.
That's awesome. I can tell you during the early days of the pandemic, we started a remodel, which I totally regret after I've added up how much we actually spent, Partha. We ordered a new front door for the house. It took over a year for that door to arrive, and then get it installed, and the whole thing. This beautiful one of a kind Robocorp hat I'm wearing also ran into logistics problems in finding its way to me, and it took 2 months before this hat showed up post order. And simple things that used to move a lot faster are certainly moving a lot slower. And it wasn't that the print company wasn't able to do the print of the hat. It was that the hat got held up in customs. Same thing with the door. So manufacturing is definitely really interesting. I think would love to definitely continue the conversation with you at some point. Maybe down the road we can do a show just on the finance sector and automation in that space, because I think there's so much that happens in when you start looking at accounts payable, and you start looking at how we're dealing with finance departments specifically. That part of the market, I think is going to continue to grow and really expand a lot. I think we're really at the beginning stages of how we can improve those departments through the use of automation. And it's not just, and you pointed this out earlier, it's not just menial tasks that humans do. It's other things that you can do with automation, beyond that, that I think are also important. Okay, 2 quick questions. Partha, if I had an actual producer for this show, which I don't, but if I did, they'd be telling me to wrap it up. Super quick, any interesting trends in RPA that you're seeing at this point? And the follow-up to that is, how do you think the RPA space is going to look 4.5 years from now?
Yeah, I will try and address them in one shot. First, I think one of the big trends is what I call as AIY. Automate it yourself, right? Like DIY, do it yourself. AIY is automate it yourself. I think next 5 years, enabling citizens to do AIY is going to be very key. Second is the whole process mining and automation space is going to come together in a big way, meaning we will not go through the current cycle of discovery, then to be process design, then a design, the technical design, and then finally an implementation. It's too long. I think that will collapse, and AI will be helping in a big way in suggesting the set or subset of the process to automate first. And even the automation, even the scripts of automation, if we have to, will be generated by AI. I think that's where we are headed. Whether it will happen in 5 or 10 years, I really can't say, but that's a trend I distinctly see that we will get to it. The third piece, which I think is probably, I think everyone sees it, is that the automation started more with rule-based automation or RPA, as we say, but then it's getting to hyper automation, meaning it is now combining the robotic side of it and the cognitive capabilities also, right? Language, speech, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all clubbed together. Now, I hear all the time CoEs say, you know what, we are doing AI and ML. With computer vision, doesn't score anybody points. But yes, beyond those, if you are doing use cases that are leveraging AI and machine learning, yeah, you score points in my book. So I think those are the three big trends, Dave, that I see, continuing.
Yeah, it's funny. The AI piece, right? The automate it yourself piece. I think fundamentally goes back to the systems that run those bots under the hood, so to speak. And like we haven't really covered this. I've written a couple articles which aren't out yet, but are coming about the broken bot syndrome, brittle bots. I spent a lot of time, once again, something I thought I'd never do while I was in high school or college, for that matter. But it is very interesting, how logging bot actions is something that a lot of the Gen 1 tools sort of, quite frankly, failed at. And so I think for the vision of AI to really work, the solving of problems when they do pop up rapidly has to be part of that. And I think the vendors, not just Robocorp, but just vendors in general, are able to solve efficiently, because problems are going to happen, and are able to pinpoint, efficiently where those problems are. Then you're going to be able to do it. We've got a mascot here at Robocorp, and it's Mark the monkey. And one of my favorite sort of slides that we put together is we've got Mark the monkey standing on top of a haystack, finding the needle. And so we've sort of developed systems for solving the broken bot problem. I'm actually surprised other vendors haven't to this point. So I think that's going to get solved across the board by everybody that's involved in Gen 2 in the future. Some of them will do it better than others, but I think that's key. The last question, which we touched on just a little bit in your last answer, and I'm just going to bring it up one more time, is my good friends over at Gartner have coined a new phrase in the marketplace in the last 12 months, and you brought it up, and a lot of us are sort of talking about it and really trying to understand what it actually means. So I'll rifle off some quick stats for you. Forrester has the RPA space as it is a 6.5 billion space by, I think, 2025. Gartner had sort of similar projections for that. And what they did last year is they said, RPA is part of something significantly bigger than that. And it's part of this hyper automation space. And they spell it as one word, by the way. And so they have it as this hyper automation space, and which from a projection standpoint sets it up to be by the end of this year a $600 billion market, which is a significantly different piece of the pie, so to speak. So one of the questions I'm asking everybody at the end, our very last question, is always, what does hyper automation actually mean to you? And I'll throw that over to you.
Yeah. So first is that what problem are we solving, right? We are solving problems of automating processes, business processes, right? Finance, supply chain, HR, you name it, right? If it's an insurance company, you credit underwriting, things like that, right?
Right.
So fundamentally, it's about capabilities that you need to bring together to make the process run automated in the best possible way, right? Now, earlier RPA meant that everything that you could define a rule for could be run by the bot, right? What's the next logical sequence? The next logical sequence is, once you have the data from which you can derive the rules, you want to put AI working on the data to bring up the rules, right? Because then you are not limited with a particular time view, right? Then you are on a moving trajectory. As the process evolves, your decision can change based on the data in near real time, right? So hence, the data becomes very key part. So in my mind, when you say hyper automation, the direction is three things. First is, any business process, what's the foundational data and what is the linkage to the master data? Is that well established, right? Because on top of only the data can we make decisions and conclusions to run the rest of the process. The second piece is, in 10 years from now, we will not be interacting with systems, IT systems, the way we do today, right? Whether it is Google Glass or other ways to interact, like, voice is becoming a very natural way of interacting. Alexa, when you go to your bank, when you call up the IVR, it's no longer presenting you a fixed set of options. So you're much free-flowing conversation, right? Which Gartner calls as multi-experience, the way we engage. So for example, today I may be logging into a Salesforce, but I don't think in 10 years from now, I will have to log in and look at the interface of Salesforce. I think I'll just tell, right? And it will happen, right? So I think that's the second fundamental shift that's going to hit the business process. The third one is that the processes themselves are going to be run by machines. Humans are going to step in to handle exceptions and some decision making, right? So in my mind, hyper automation is the stack of technologies that together can make this vision happen. Today, what that stack includes is OCR, right? Computer vision.
Yep.
RPA, process mining, language, speech, NLP, chatbots, which is the cognitive side of it, and then decision making, AI and on decision making. These are all components in that whole hyper automation stack, but I think they will get closer together as we go by. Okay.
All right. Definitely a comprehensive answer. I haven't always gotten comprehensive answers to that question. So Partha, I think that's one of the best ones we've had so far, an understanding of it. I will say this. Last week, we went on a drive, and my wife, you've got Apple Maps and Google Maps, and then my wife uses Waze, which is a fantastic app here in North America. It actually warns you like a half a mile before you might come up on a police officer, which is a fantastic piece of automation. And especially if you may have been breaking the law a little bit, it is a good thing to have. One of the things that always fascinates me about that app is that it's all about taking real-time data and plotting better courses for you from one place to another. So it's not a static app. It's actually using real-time information to make suggestions and modifications based on a combination of data that they're getting from, Highway Patrol, data that they're getting from a Google and an Apple Maps, and then user data that is supplied based on the actions of the vehicles, the cars slowing down, cars speeding. It's very, very interesting. My big complaint about Waze is, and I told my wife this, is that it doesn't use British Siri. So I can't have the British Siri accent, which I so much love. Anyways, Partha, listen, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I've really enjoyed our time on talking with you today. At this point, I want to thank Partha. Partha, I'll let you pronounce your last name.
Mukhopadhyay.
You did that so well. Partha, the co-founder and CEO of Senzcraft, I want to thank you for joining me on Beyond the Bot today. For the BTB, I am Dave Dabbah, the CMO at Robocorp, wishing you all a tremendous rest of your work week.
Beyond the Bot is a production of Robocorp, where the world comes together to automate. For more information on Robocorp, check us out at robocorp.com.